University on Europe's Periphery, written together Dorothy Boyle, was published by Cornell University, and also it was awarded by the prestigious Stein Rockham Prize for Comparative Social Science Research in 2013. Currently, Béla Greskovits is visiting at the Robert Schuman Center at the UI, and is going to go back in Vienna, but we are very glad to have him today with us. And Béla, the floor is yours. When you want to start, we are very happy to listen to you. As usually, I ask everybody to switch off the video during the presentation, and then, of course, we will reappear in video. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Manuela, and thank you all the colleagues at SNS for this invitation. I find it really fantastic to share ideas with this community. And I actually worked quite a bit to present here something for you that I can describe as work in progress. So let me share now the PowerPoint. I have about 13 slides to present, and then we will discuss everything.
Okay, we still don't see your PowerPoint.
Okay, just a second. You will see in a minute.
Perfect. We see it
Yeah.
now. Yes, we see
You can see it now, okay?
Oh, not anymore?
Just
okay.
a slideshow, yeah. Okay, is it all right now?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so as you see from the title, this is a very ambitious title, and with Manuela we were thinking a lot what to present you here, and the outcome is something that ties my original interest in comparative political economy of East Central Europe with my ongoing work on right-wing civil society in Hungary and also increasingly in the region, and a very new research interest, which is gender. And let me tell you why I developed an interest, a new interest in aspects of gender. So when I see the political science and political economy traditions of thought and how it developed since the Great Recession and since the rise of what people call authoritarian populism, I realized that there is a good news that critical studies came back with a vengeance. Capitalist criticism came back with a vengeance, but there is also a bad news that many of the approaches, including reformed varieties of capitalism, growth models, growth regimes, renewed dependency theory, are still gender blind. So the main heroes of these critical studies are still white collar or blue collar white male manufacturing workers. And this is a problem because it means that there is a blind spot here, and not only a question of equity. What we see now, especially with the pandemics, is the importance of non-manufacturing sectors of the economy, the care sectors of the economy, the household, management of family, healthcare, elderly care, and the like. So basically, the idea is to open up comparative political economy to issues of gender much more consciously than even our current work did. Now, of course, whenever you start reading about it, and I am really at the beginning, so I have a lot to learn from researchers in gender issues, that feminist political economy has a lot to offer here, right? So what that could actually mean, that the real task is here to bridge two approaches, varieties of capitalism with feminist political economy. And this is also a footnote that in this presentation, when I talk about gender, I talk about women. I am not talking about all the rest, what is important and is understood in a broader definition of gender. So my focus is on women. So let me first show you the outline. What I try to do, I try to first locate the Hungarian case, which is my basic interest here and focus here, in a comparative context. First, I will show you a couple of few data about gender inequality and the disjunct patterns in an East-West European context. Then I try to explain you how rival views of capitalism, as they were represented and presented after the collapse of state socialism, considered the impact of the systemic change on politics in the region, and how then this can be translated into gender inequality after socialism, especially in political empowerment. Then I show you that actually, while there are structural reasons that differentiate between the East and the West of Europe in terms of gender political empowerment, there is variation within the East as well. And Hungary performs here very, very badly. Then I introduce you shortly my work in progress on the Hungarian civic circles movement and my first attempts to analyze my empirical material from the viewpoint of women movement and women activism in right-wing civil society. And then I show you a little bit how from the prefigurative politics of right-wing civil society we come to a repressive conservative gender regime under 12 years so far of conservative, right-wing conservative rule. By now we can, in all likelihood, claim far-right conservative, far-right rule in Hungary. Okay, so let me show you first a couple of data which I compiled from the gender gap studies of the World Economic Forum. This shows 4 aspects of gender inequality or equality: educational attainment, health and survival, opportunity, and participation in the economic activities and political empowerment. And what you see here, it's quite interesting pattern. In educational attainment, the gender gap or gender equality index shows roughly the same achievements in the so-called old EU members and the new EU members on average. Of course, countries differ in both groups, but basically gender equality, equality between male and female prevails pretty similarly in 2006, both in the western and southern and the eastern part of Europe, in terms of educational attainment and health and survival. Now, the picture is more interesting in economic participation and opportunity, where in both big sub-regions of Europe, or both halves, let's say, of Europe, there is much more to do for females to reach equal positions with males in economic participation. But in this respect, the eastern part of EU does, on average, does even slightly better than the EU 17, on average. Now, of course, there comes the last big issue, which is political empowerment. So in political empowerment, both regions actually perform the worst. So there is a lot to do both in the West, or the non-East, and the East. Yet, here is as well where the difference between the old member states and the new member states is most prominent. So you see in the East, the political empowerment of women on average is only half of the otherwise rather modest achievements of political empowerment of women in the old members of the EU. Now, how to understand this? So obviously there is a puzzle here, the East-West puzzle in political empowerment. So, and the East-West relative equality in education and health issues. So during the post-communist transition, or the transition from socialist to the capitalist system, there were basically four kinds of views equally strongly represented, and rival views, which tried to understand and explain the political effect of systemic transformation. And based on the work of Albert Hirschman, who wrote a classic article about rival views of capitalism, I tried to reconstruct and adapt his framework on the post-socialist conditions. So there were basically two big families of views represented that attributed important impact, political impact, to the persistence of the socialist legacy, and two other views that basically attributed very important political impact on the dominance of capitalist expansion. Now, obviously, both legacies and capitalist market expansion were important formative aspects of the politics of the transforming East Central Europe. Now, in both families of views, there were those who stressed positive effects of the legacy and negative effects, and positive effects of free market expansion, and also destructive effects of free market expansion. So the persistence of socialist legacy was seen positively by those who basically believed that socialism, for all its faults and negative features, meant a hidden prosperity in issues of freely available healthcare, general healthcare, universal social care, and education. And this legacy actually made political democratization and liberal politics during the transformation easier. Then there were those who were extremely critical with socialism, basically defined the terms of the socialist legacy in terms of the legacy of Leninism, by which they meant that socialism produced basically homo sovieticus, mutually suspicious persons, unable to tolerate different views, open to reactionary views in issues of gender, in issues of terms of political tolerance, and so on. So this negative Leninist legacy basically made it almost impossible in this view to achieve democracy with a socialist past. Now, let's turn to the other set of views, the dominance of capitalist expansion. There were, of course, the market utopians and optimists who argued, many of them were among the policymakers, political advisors of the new post-socialist government, that free markets lead to freedom in politics as well. The arguments were varied, but the basic logic of the argument was that free markets are the systems that most effectively create wealth. Some even argued equality. Increasing wealth and acceptable equality measures are the best for liberal democracy. And then we have the free market road to serfdom thesis, which basically claims the opposite, saying that since expansion of free markets creates economic inequality and political exclusion, the danger to political liberalism comes from the reliance of economic liberalism. This was a formulation which I cite from David Ost. The issue is workers betrayed, abandoned by the market transformation, losing their jobs, losing their security, turn prey to easy demagogues, xenophobes, people arguing against Western integration. So this is a thesis in which capitalism, especially its radical version, undermines its political base. Okay, how was this then translated to understanding the gender gap in political empowerment? And here you see basically the four theses, but as I read them off or into current research, at least the few which are so far managed to read and understand in studies on gender. So the persistence of the socialist legacy. Yes, it was to some extent positive, the argument goes, but this was sort of a state feminism, top-down emancipation, which was not really conducive to political empowerment. The negative effects of the persistent socialist legacy is something that is empirically shown, that in East Central Europe, Engelhart's silent revolution was lagging, partly because of the relative poverty of East European societies, but also partly education under state socialism was anything but liberal in its content. So the kind of values and the related political activism that basically gives the core of social movement studies in a post-war Western economic settings, was simply either missing or was weak in East Central Europe. Then in terms of the dominance of capitalist expansion, of course, there is this idea that there was an expansion, not only in terms of economic neoliberalism, but also in terms of political liberalism. Now, the problem is, as it is described by, among others, Nancy Fraser or Kotzi, and they are not alone with this, that feminism arrived to the East and female emancipation arrived to the East as an export of cultural feminism in which Western feminists gave up their original concern about material equality and turned probably overwhelmingly to issues of recognition and arrived to the East in a dangerous liaison or alliance, an unholy alliance with economic neoliberalism. So this is again more an effect that turned at least ambiguous, probably negative. And then the last story is the negative effects, self-undermining effects of market expansion. Dispossessed workers turn prey of populists, cynical political leaders who use their status anxiety and economic grievances as an argument to start a war, among other things and other issues, on gender, right? Now, this is, of course, quite a bleak picture, because if you look at it, the problems with this picture, even if there is a lot of truth in it, is that the negative outcome, which we see documented in the data or indicated by the data, is almost overdetermined. It's almost inevitable. What we see here, structural differences between the West and the East, or old members and new members, but without agency. So especially there is no native female agency, or it is invisible. And then there is also an issue here that much of the blame for gender political inequality in political empowerment is on liberals. Now, the interesting and maybe provocative question here is, how far is this blame from the spirit of the populist double attack on liberalism as an agent of dispossession and of ill-conceived emancipation? So there is some, however, another puzzle related on what I just told. So the explanation of the disjunction between, in terms of political empowerment of women, between the West and the East, cannot be only explained by structural reasons. Why? What I show you here is that although political empowerment in EU 11, as well as change of political empowerment between 2006 and 2021, is lower overall than in the West or the old member states, Hungary is an outlier, is an extreme case, both in terms of where political empowerment stood in 2006 and how political empowerment changed between 2006 and 2021. So even within the East, that is lagging behind in terms of political empowerment, the there are cases which perform better in this respect and cases which perform worse in this respect. Hungary is certainly a case which is an extreme case. So there is a lot to understand here in terms of how actually agency should be brought in the picture. I just tell you here that this is, of course, a possibility for a comparative outline of a comparative research in both of these data. Lithuania is the positive extreme. Okay, if it is not just structure, but agency should also matter, we also can say it's not just the economy either that explains the difference in terms of political empowerment of women. Why? I produced here two sets of data where Hungary is compared to the 11 new member states of the EU in terms of economic index of economic freedom over 2006 and 2021. What you see here is quite incredible, namely that Hungary, despite the rule of Fidesz for 12 years, basically maintained its features, of course with some decline, but minor decline, of economic neoliberalism. At the same time, the index of political rights and civil liberties, based on the numbers of the statistical data Freedom House, declined dramatically in Hungary, roughly from 2010 until 2021, whereas in the other countries, which maintained economic liberalism as well as Hungary, index of political rights and civil liberties on average did not decline. Here again, there are country-specific differences. Everybody knows Poland is another case, which is close to Hungary, while in other countries, actually, the economic freedom and political freedom even increased, right? Now, okay, here, if it is about agency, where do we find agency? And here I bring in a short introduction of my work in progress on the civic circles, Hungarian civic circles movement. You can get more details from my paper published in East European Politics in 2020, which was circulated. But let me just do a short introduction of the movement in general. This was a movement which was founded by Viktor Orbán in 2002, after his party Fidesz lost marginally an election against a coalition that came to rule then and ruled the country for 8 years, 8 consecutive years of left and liberal parties. So he then basically saying in a very Gramscian way that the nation cannot be in opposition. If it cannot be in opposition, then of course it has to come to power in one way or another. Founded a movement which combined grassroots organizations with a large number of hierarchical organizations and networks, and recreated over 2002 and 2006, 2007, which were the heyday of the movement, the entire grassroots networks, ideologies, heroes, holidays of the and practices of the Hungarian right. So the movement was militant, massive, dominantly metropolitan and urban, and educated, social conservative middle class based. By militant, I mean both that the movement had a Gramscian hegemonic aspiration and ideology, had a lot of collective protest, was massive, according to the estimates of its leaders. The movement had more than 100,000 members, which is comparable to the combined membership of all Hungarian political parties of that time, organized about 5,000 activities, according to my database, about which I will tell a word soon, in about 1,000 municipalities, both in Hungary and in the neighboring Hungarian populated, ethnic Hungarian populated areas of the neighboring countries. It was dominantly metropolitan and urban, meaning in the capital, the movement was mostly present and strongest in the relatively wealthy districts, but much weaker in the worker district, working class communities, and urban, meaning they were also strong in the bigger and middle-sized cities of the countryside, but also transborder. So civic circles existed in the neighboring countries and in the US, Canada, and Argentina, having large Hungarian diasporas. And educated, social conservative, middle class based, meaning this was a movement of conservative teachers, doctors, lawyers, the clergy, media people, and small entrepreneurs. The movement agenda was double. First, it was education. The slogan you see here again is incredibly Gramscian if you think about it. The recapture of everyday life and the holidays. What is this? This is a title of a manual for civic circles. The movement organized competition for civic circles describing their best practices. And this was a booklet written by a civic circle member in Budapest about how one can, through what kind of practices can the right recapture of everyday life and the holidays. It's a 120 pages long book with very, very practical suggestions of what to do, how to organize, how to self-educate, how to get help for it, and how to gain political influence and policy influence. This was one of about 20 manuals that I found in my material. The alternative to self-education was participation both in conventional and non-conventional politics. Between 2002 and 2006, about 1,300 church-related events were organized, almost 2,000 patriotic or nationalist events, and relative to the, or in conformity with the contentious character of the movement, more than 400 protest events and 400 events which were somewhere in between conventional politics, but it could easily turn into protest. They meant electoral mobilization. So here, let me tell you one word about the database I use. So this is an events database of about 5,000 events organized by the movement between 2002 and 2006. It has events, basically, which mean communication, but it has events with participants in protests, events participating in tourism trips to the holy places of former Greater Hungary, media events, events organized for families, and so on and so forth. The basis of my collection of data is archival, and the core source that I use is an electronic newsletter of the civic circles, which was sent to circulated among civic circles, and I compiled the events from the event calendar and the communication I found in this electronic newsletter. I still work on the data. You know, if you would print this newsletter, it would basically give you 5,000 pages of printed material. And I am basically learning these 5,000 pages by heart. It's big fun to work with the material. Now, recently, as I told you, I started to analyze the database from the viewpoint of female activism in an overall conservative masculine movement. So the first thing I want to tell you about is that obviously this was a masculine movement. So if you look at conferences, lectures, summer camps organized by the movement, you see many more so-called all-male panels, which you would expect, than events in which females participate. So basically my estimation at this point, although as I told you, this is work in progress, that 20% of the events had the participation of females, still quite a bit. You know, that means, of course, 1,000 events. So more interesting is that those women who participate and their organizations, because very often these participants represent female organizations, women organizations, they concentrate in the care sectors, not surprisingly, right? Healthcare, social work, charity, family, and education. These are also where the educated females, conservative females, work. Their original motivation was not material. That is very clear from the fact that in 2002, when the social liberal government took over, they raised quite significantly the wages and decreased the taxes of the public sector workers, mainly run by and employing women. So the issue here rather was that these participants, both the female and the male participants, were keen on fighting for the representation of their conservative values and worldviews in media, in the newspapers, in the TV, in policy, and in education. So the issue was pretty much, at least originally, driven by issues of culture and identity. Okay, another group of women came from art, entertainment, and media, music, literature, visual arts, folk dance, songs, and folk artisanship. Again, not particularly surprising, but still interesting in connection of a movement that, of course, wants to reunite the nation according to principles of ethnic nationalism. Now, the sectoral concentration, which I just touched upon, is, of course, extremely interesting and significant. Why? Because it means a strong local presence on the one hand for the movement, because municipal schools, general practitioners, hospitals and their clientele, add to it the churches, are present in practically every municipality. So that means that the movement that can mobilize this kind of activists can have a strong local spread. It's not just a movement that is, you know, somewhere existing, elevated to the top of society. No, that was strongly locally present activism. At the same time, the strong local presence gave an opportunity for attacking neoliberal reforms, which during the period of 2002, 2006, and even later, consisted dominantly so-called rationalization of health and educational infrastructure, meaning that local healthcare units, hospital departments, local schools were closed, basically stripping the local communities from their infrastructure because of reasons of economic rationality and economic ineffectivity, as it was basically suggested by the World Bank. Now, of course, when local civic circle organizers, female organizers, teachers, doctors, built protest coalitions with the patients and their families, with students and pupils and their families, and defended the infrastructural base of their local existence. That sounded quite a credible, contentious target. Okay, now the interesting thing is, knowing that these organizations and the civic circles themselves were not the kind of civil society that liberal philosophy praises for being tolerant, for being open, for being in love with diversity, and so on. They were often exclusive. There were restrictions on what kind of civic circles could not be founded. For instance, civic circles for gay people were not allowed. So gay people wanted to found their own, conservative gay people wanted to found, and lesbians wanted to found their own civic circles and were rejected by the movement. But then, knowing all this, what these movements and the female participants did, is their mobilization a good news or a bad news for gender equality in political empowerment? I leave this question open. I think it's more interesting. The question is more interesting. Probably it's not a simple question. Okay, now I come to the close soon of my presentation. And I just want to tell you very much a bird's eye view of how I see the current gender regime of the Orbán regime over its 12 years in power, where the movement, the civic circle movement, saw itself as a context for the prefigurative politics of what could become reality in a right-wing conservative rule, meaning playing with the kind of life, displaying the kind of life that they would have liked to live. The regime itself became increasingly repressive and conservative in terms of its gender regime. So we can say that war on gender was on the headlines of the regime roughly since 2010. This meant, now I just list a couple of things. There are better researchers of this aspect than me. I will learn from them when we go further. Attacks on gender studies, which is a phenomenon of 2017. Very strong attacks on LGBT rights, on non-traditional families, which are not accepted as family, and this is now in the constitution and taught in the school, elementary school, attacks against emancipatory NGOs, attacks on liberal education in general, and even on sensitivizing art. So what you see here, pictures of a recent phenomenon when an artist in a district close to our flat in Budapest, by the way, erected with the support of the local municipality as a monument, an artistic piece, pretty provocative, about the Black Lives Matter movement. And you see how this looked originally. So it's the freedom statue in a rainbow color, and it was standing there in a public park with the support of the municipality. Now, far-right people came and demolished very fast the statue and told that such a statue should not stand in a public park in Budapest because it is combining everything which is which is satanic. So, or we see basically the demolishing of books, making even books of tales, making kids sensitive to differences of gender and diversity of issues of gender. So it became, so on the headlines there is a strong war on gender. And then there is, of course, also a subtext of this policy, which is divide and pacify, which is meaning the following. So Hungary is not just negatively an extreme case in terms of political disempowerment of women or lack of political empowerment within the EU11 group. It is also a positive outlier in terms of public expenditure for family, education, and active labor market policies, or public expenditure on the European social, on the data of the based on the categories of the European social policy networks, social investment areas, which include spending on childcare, spending on the equal right of parents to work, and spending on abolishing labor market exclusion, right? So Hungary does very well in terms of both kinds of social investment policies relative to other East European countries, but even relative to a number of old EU member states. I don't have time, and I'm not yet there to discuss the whole variation. So that's the other aspect here, which basically has a chance to divide and pacify the female movements, the issues of gender movements, in a way buying political loyalty through welfare policy and labor market policy measures. So it's a sophisticated policy, all in all, I would say. And this then takes me to the last slide, which is probably some generalizable lessons, also sort of guidelines for my own research. And of course, I would like if this kind of lessons could be provocative enough for others to do similar kind of inquiries. So the first, the agency of the right is important for the ascendance of the right. Now, this sounds evident and obvious and almost ridiculously obvious, but still this issue, I think, is somewhat neglected amidst the left and liberal soul-searching about betraying the white male manufacturing working class. It's not only about the liberal betrayal. It is also about the right that has done their homework pretty well in mobilizing for their own agenda. The next, the haves of human capital are no less important for the rise of the right as the have-nots. So the issue is not just a cognitive problem, as populism is often presented. It is not just about cynical political leaders seducing an uneducated electorate or group of followers by promising them promises which will never be fulfilled. So there is more to it than simply an issue of lack of understanding of basic facts. The third is probably important, especially for people like us who are interested in social movements and civil society, the arena of civil society organizations and civic activism, including those of the educated conservative women, is as important in the right's political breakthrough as the electoral arena. And here, there may be a contribution by doing this kind of study to what I consider populism's blind spot, namely the supply side of politics, the organizations, the ideologies, the networks that elaborate solutions of the right for political problems. And then there is also a preliminary evidence on the agency of educated women on the road towards a repressive, conservative gender regime. So I think this is also probably close to how things really are in general. So interestingly, women in many ways are victims of such repressive, conservative gender regimes. But probably should also be seen that's not only the case. So in some sense, certain groups of women, even educated women, are sovereign shapers as well of the regimes that are generally anti-gender and repressive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Béla, for this inspiring and very ambitious research agenda. And I will leave immediately the floor to Ivan comment, since I guess he can have many comments. Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you, Professor. I would start by saying that the blame is not only on liberals, as you say, but probably also on social movement scholarship to an extent that it largely lamented on the fragility and the weakness of civil society in Eastern Europe because of this blind spot for basically conservative movements or what Kopetsky and Mude called uncivil society. And here I would like to start by highlighting your point on the importance of the cosmopolitan liberal versus the national populist cleavage, which you mentioned in the article, and related to very, let's say, material dimension of Western donor dependency of liberal civil society in Central and Eastern Europe. And as Kopetsky and Mude wrote, the civil society, which exists mainly in reports and boardrooms of major NGOs and governmental offices of the West. And I think from this perspective, the civic circles definitely belong to this kind of overlooked conservative movement from Eastern Europe. And the relevance is even bigger if we look at the period of mobilization, which is before the Great Recession, which you also mentioned. in your article, so we cannot just reduce it to economic grievances. But I want to also refer to the Polish case where Marta Ralusko writes about the technocratic manner of developing specific gender equality policies and gender mainstreaming policies. And she writes that promoting gender equality in an undemocratic manner that eludes parliamentary control and public debate may cause a kind of counter response. So my question here would be, or more comment on to what extent the so-called democratic deficit of the European Union has contributed, not only the neoliberal or political economic aspect, which of course I'm not an expert in, so I'm discussing that which is more familiar to me, but I think this is an important point as well, this aspect of the kind of non-democratic or lack of public debates, which was also very evident in the discussions on the Istanbul Convention and attacks on the so-called Grevio body of experts, which allegedly controls or influences national politics. To compare briefly to Croatian case, we have a similar situation which is more related to the religious and Catholic upper middle class of lawyers, entrepreneurs, teachers, and theologians as well, who are mobilizing in this backlash against gender ideology. And here I have a more practical question regarding the middle class character of the Civic Circles movement, and how did you measure this, or how does this appear in the data? Because I'm having problems as well in my research with kind of assessing the let's say class character of the anti-gender movement in Croatia. And I think one difference is in Croatia that the participants in the movement, even though the so-called elites or movement leaders are upper middle class, are lower middle class or even poor in a lot of the events or a lot of the cases. Maybe this is related to the Catholic Church and its role in outreach to poorer communities and the marginalized communities, but I have no evidence for this as of yet. I think also your article is important. It emphasizes the emotional aspect of far-right mobilization. What you mention as deep stories, symbols, and feelings, mostly in relation to the Trianon events. And I think it's important because mostly in far-right studies and social movement studies, we deal with negative or fear-mongering emotions of scapegoating. While I think in the Central and Eastern European cases, but generally as well, that this positive building of national pride is very important for a right-wing social movements. And then when it comes to gender and women, attacking gender ideology is also a way to reaffirm this biological natural difference between the sexes. And it reaffirms the idea that women's unpaid labor, which is also emotional labor in the household, or the reproductive labor, it reaffirms the notion that it is natural or that it is not in a way work, as feminists or socialist feminists would argue. So the criticism of gender ideology makes sense even from this liberal or neoliberal point of view, because it obscures the unpaid labor of women. The repertoire, the analysis of repertoires, also in the original articles, I found very interesting, and we could conceptualize it as what Eitan Alimi calls intra-movement repertoires. And here he draws mostly from LGBT and Black activism in the United States. So in my case, it's very interesting because the anti-gender movement in a lot of ways and often mirrors precisely these LGBT and feminist repertoires of action, which, as nationalists like to say, are imported from the West as well. And this brings me to more specifically to the gender issues related to gender that you raised, and the invisibility of native female agency. And I've been reading recently about these movements in Poland, the Childbirth with Dignity Association, and the so-called home birth movement in Hungary, from the book by Jacobson and Saxenberg. So I wonder to what extent these mother associations, mothers or parental associations, are relevant in Hungary within the civic circles, but also outside of the civic circles movement. But this is not really familiar to me because I'm not that familiarized with the Hungarian case. I was also wondering, I have a lot of questions because the topic is really close to my work, so I will try to wrap it up soon. There are some tensions in the Croatian right-wing case, anti-gender right-wing mobilization between more neoliberal libertarian actors which argue for privatization, homeschooling, and on the other hand, there is the more Catholic, traditional Catholic social teaching aspect, which demands a stronger but somewhat, of course, conservative welfare state. I think this is also a kind of important division, at least in Southeast Europe in some of the cases. Finally, I wanted to just refer to something that Professor Peto wrote in her article on the gendered modus operandi. And she writes that unlike Polish universal family benefits, the Hungarian family and social policies favor those who are better off. And she mentions that the flat income tax rate and the policies that target those who live in bigger apartments. So I don't know if you agree, and do you think this maybe is also related to the middle class character of the movement and the women who are kind of active within the movement? Thank you very much once again, and we are a bit out of time, but I hope there's still time for some discussions and questions or answers.
Thank you, Ivan. And Béla, I don't know if you prefer to react immediately to Ivan's comments, or because there are a couple of questions more from Donatella and Riccardo Emilio. Shall we collect also them?
Yeah, questions 4, and then at the end I would like to, of course, react. Wonderful discussion. Thank you, Ivan.
Donatella?
Yes, thank you, Béla. This is very interesting, and I agree very much about your critique about the lack of civic society in Central Eastern Europe. It is not the problems of lacking civil society organizations, but of which type of civil society organizations do we have. I just wanted to go back a bit to the comparative dimension to see how this can help bringing agency back in. And there, connecting it with my own work on democratization in Central Eastern Europe. It seems already then that Hungary and Poland were following a similar path, differently than Czechoslovakia at that time, and of course the GDR. How does it play in the type of developments that you are looking at, the different paths of democratizations? Do you think it plays a role? And also looking at the movement, counter-movement dynamics. What we see at the moment in Poland is a very mobilized feminist movements against the regimes that the way in which you describe it resemble a Christian democratic regimes of the past in Southern Europe. And but there it seems that some different developments happen in Hungary and in Poland, notwithstanding the fact that also in Poland there was a deep-rooted right-wing societies. So thank you a lot.
And Riccardo Emilio, Riccardo?
Yes, thanks a lot. I mean, first of all, I have to admit that both Ivan and Donatella have basically already posed the questions that I wanted to pose. So first of all, I want to congratulate with Professor Greskovits, because it was really interesting to see how to basically use both political economy approach and more agentic social movements perspective. I really like this kind of work, and also to see how structure basically is composed by organized collective actors, and so there is a critical role of organized collective actors in shaping structural trends. I wanted just to have some clarifications on what do you define explicitly as a feminist political economy. So there are, of course, a wide range of feminist scholars and perspectives. So what do you mean by this need to use more feminist political economy approach? And on the other hand, I was wondering if there are some similarities in these mobilizations of illiberal groups. For example, I was thinking to what has already been studied in a very different region, like Nordic countries, like Norway, with the illiberal far-right movements that defend, it seems a paradox, LGBT rights, but mobilizing against Islam. So anti-Islamism that defend LGBT rights. So to some extent, it seems to me a bit similar to this mobilization of a conservative gender movement against LGBT rights. So if could be potentially also a comparison. Then the last comment is, it's true that there is a clear Gramscian language, I would say. Is it really explicit? So is there any explicit reference to Gramsci, as we found, for example, in some Steve Bannon's discourse, that means that there is a counter use of Gramsci from the far right that should be probably more studied on the point of view of the sociology of intellectual. Thanks a lot.
I see that there are 3 more questions, so I don't know if really you want to collect also them, and then you answer at the end. Okay, so Guglielmo, and then Hans-Jörg and Carlo. Thank you.
Thank you, Béla. Hope you can hear me well. I have a bad connection, unfortunately. Thank you, very interesting. Comparatively, I think in general on gender, the Northwest. No, you can't. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can hear you, but there is a sound.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to talk with the gardener. Just a second. Is it okay?
Sure.
Working here.
I will write my question in the meanwhile.
Yeah.
Manuela, I write my question. It's easier, okay?
Si sente una...
Yeah, I write it and then you'll read it.
Comunque si riesce a sentire, c'è solo un rumore elettronico di fondo, ma si riesce a sentire come volume.
I am very sorry. Hopefully now it moves. Yeah. Sorry, Guglielmo, I hear you.
I try. Comparatively, on the gender dimension, in general, the North-West divide is more important than the East-West. The bars that you show are distorted by the fact there is more Souths in the West. than in the East. So we have Spain, Italy, Greece that push all the West down on economic equality, while there is less South in the East. But still, the East-West is interesting. And one element maybe you haven't included is on the employment, specifically the employment tradition of communism. In this ambiguous Leninist legacy, an important one is that the idea of equal opportunities in employment doesn't resonate, doesn't mean anything to women who work under communism, who experience full female formal employment, something that capitalism has never had in any country. And therefore, which explains why policies like the Polish ones of paying women to stay home are extremely popular, because the freedom for women is freedom to stay at home, not freedom to work, because working they have always worked, and there is nothing new in that. So that is my main question. I just add that Poland, I think, would fit much of your argument, even if, of course, in before peace, the mobilization of the right in Poland was not against the socialists, as in Hungary, it was against the liberal. So above all, it was anti-liberal. It was not anti-socialist, and therefore it was more working class than liberal. That is the big political distinction. But otherwise, your line of analysis is, I think, very fertile for comparative analysis in the region. Thank you.
Hans-Jörg?
Thanks. I can see why you prefer agency as an explanatory variable. This results in a very rich comparative research design, of course, and it is preferable over structural or political economy variables to explain these differences, in particular when it comes to political empowerment. However, I wonder whether under such an agency perspective, it still makes sense to compare the blocks as you did at the beginning of your talk. You were emphasizing yourself that the East, of course, that the countries that constitute the so-called new member states, that there are huge discrepancies. The same, however, also holds for the West. So especially with regard to political empowerment, if you compare, for instance, the South and the North of Europe, you would find huge discrepancies as well. And the common explanation there for these discrepancies in the West, in the old member states, is not agency, but culture, actually. So I wonder to what extent culture then would also play a role as an explanatory variable.
And now the last comment, Carlo.
Thank you. So I can only acknowledge all the positive comments already mentioned and fully agree. I think the only question that I would like to maybe the thing that remains unanswered also relates to what Guillermo was asking. So I was wondering, what is the role of anti-socialist discourse in mobilization of right-wing in Hungary? Because comparing this case to the cases that I follow mostly, and primarily I'm talking here about Slovenia, Croatia, and to an extent Serbia, we can see that it's not really, I mean, anti-liberalism is really important, but anti-socialism, and especially in Slovenia, really makes up the core of right-wing discourse about this imaginary enemy, again, who is constraining or who is working against the common good. So that's all.
I think it's enough. So Béla, floor is yours.
Okay, I tried the impossible. Fantastic questions, and thank you. So I am really happy I shared work in progress, because this of course also helps me to think much clearer in what I want to do next, and And thank you very much for the productive responses and criticism. I will be very short, and I pick questions only, because I guess, do I have 10 minutes all in all, or that's too ambitious? Is it okay to, yeah. So let's start with the discussion by Ivan. So he mentioned the NGOization and the problem of NGO Western input, and you know how this actually affected or impacted the problem of lack of democratic debate and discussion of basic things. So yes, this is a very important issue, and what I actually want to do a parallel research on the liberal NGOs, especially the group of liberal NGOs that are were funded by George Soros and his Open Society Foundation. And given my workplace, I am quite well situated to do empirical research on this. What happened there, and what happened until the whole sector was basically crushed by Orban. Now the next issue is that how do I know, this practical issue, how do I know that I talk about middle class people? First of all, I have direct information. So when I go through my 5,000 events, I can see who is doctor, who is not in the participants, what kind of organizations are they represented. We have the topic of the presentations, coming together, conferences. We are talking about, that's very important, we are talking about a mass organization before Facebook and Twitter, right? So, but internet was already there. Again, an indication that the participants who communicate either by internet or, in the worst case, by phone, you know, are not really, you know, sort of lower class people, subaltern groups. Many events require fees. And, you know, if I look at the topics of the event, so who would pay a fee for such an event? Again, an indication. And the last is, I have the spatial distribution of the events. And I told you earlier, working class neighborhoods, almost absent, right? So this was during this time still the stronghold of the socialists and then the far right, but not the conservative right. Okay, role of emotions. I fully agree with you. Positive emotions must be absolutely seriously taken. These people felt solidarity with people across the border, but also be solidaristic with those who felt the same ways, right? They felt well because they were taken seriously in politics. So in these local circles, you know, they could do politics. This was the first time that it happened to them. They felt they had a role in shaping their future, which partly was, of course, fake news. So they didn't have so much, but they felt they had. And of course, there were negative fears of blaming, of being blamed, which happened every other day, as fascists, anti-Semites, mobs. Fear of mistreatment and dispossession of institutions by the tyrannic government, that their values are not represented. And there was another fear that they are infiltrated, spied upon, and subverted by hostile elements. Now, this, of course, was in conflict with the expansive character of the movement. Now, let me just tell here something about the Gramscian question. So the interesting story here is that we have a leader Viktor Orbán, who wrote his MA dissertation in 1987 on civil organization, social organization in an authoritarian system. The case of Polish solidarity. This was 87. You find there 5, 6, 7 references to Antonio Gramsci. You know, how do you do? How do you fight? How do you take over society before you take over power? Alan Turing, Habermas, and things like that. In addition to it, there is, of course, a wide discussion among the young right in Hungary, the new right, that Gramsci should not be left to the left. We need Gramsci, they say. This is, by the way, of course, not new since the French New Right. So but it's present in Hungary. Okay, the next is the mothers and parental movements issue. They are very important, of course. Mothers with many children are, on the one hand, ideas for the Madonna cult is important, but also, you know, among the events, there were many events for family organization, for single mothers, even how to cope with the fact of being a single mother, with the strong participation in all of this, the Christian churches, all the historical churches. There were events discussing the Catholic social doctrine, which is anti-liberal and anti-neoliberal, strongly. It is against poverty, and it is against a paternalistic welfare provision, right? The religious orders and congregations were very important, but not the only ones organizing charity. So charity was basically the civic circle's social policy. They were not in power, so they did two things. The professional organizations tried to criticize and implement social policy perspectives. The rank and file tried to collect charities for Hungarians and as well as people in the countryside, okay, in the other countries. Now, the next issue. Ricardo's question, just very shortly. When I try to learn, and this is not over, so my learning is just, you know, I enjoy very much reading feminist political economy. You know, I read basically everything by Fraser. So the major ambition here is, since our comparative political economy of Eastern European capitalism with Dorothee Bole is a Polanyian thing, and Fraser wrote a lot about how to use Polanyi in a post-Polanyian way, critically using Polanyi in understanding feminist politics and political economy. This is a major inspiration. There is very good work in Hungary and across the region, which I try to learn. So I could mention a couple of names, from Dorothea Sikra to Eva Fodor, and many others. Also, you know, people concentrated in our expelled gender studies department at CEU. So yeah, these are the people. Donatella, the comparative dimension. So of course, the next step would be really to compare Poland and Hungary and how the initial, more neoliberal Hungarian way compares with the slower, more gradual, more ambivalent Polish story, and how this affects dealing with issues of gender politics and gender. And at the same time, how a much stronger, much more vibrant civil society of Poland compares, even liberal civil society, compares with the Hungarian, mostly imported liberal civil society. is a next step in this research. And so I very much appreciate your comparative reference points. Now, as to both a question of Guglielmo and trends. So the comparative issue is here important, but I only made the first steps towards it. And in the end, this will not be a West-East comparison. I just wanted to locate first the region within the bigger European context. It will be East European comparative political economy. I might be interesting to, now I am in love with Italy, so I might take a look, but I will not be an expert on Italy. And what can be learned from the West and the South? I read Donatella, I read Manuela, I read you guys, and teach you as well. But what then will be used here is really an East European comparative political economy, because here with Dorothee we do have a sort of a stake and some knowledge, and we got really a little bit bored with talking always about the white male manufacturing workers. There are other things important in the world, other sectors and so on. So yeah, I am sure I might not have answered all the questions.
I think the discussion has been very, very lively and for sure fruitful for everyone. And so I would like to, and you answered I think all of the questions that have been raised, but of course there is room for further reflections and so I would like to, I would say now time is out, so I will stop here with Béla seminar. And thank you once again for this presentation and for being with us, although our lunch seminar was postponed since last year due to the COVID emergency. So thank you once again, Béla, and we hope to see you sooner or later, perhaps in person at the faculty.
Thank you so much again. Thank you for the invitation, the nice comments, and I really, really enjoyed this session. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Be safe.
Grazie, Béla.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.